Welcome back to the deep dive. If you manage infrastructure or, if you've ever written a line of code that actually impacts users, there is one rule,
Oh, yeah.
one time-tested, almost sacred rule.
Yeah.
You never deploy changes directly to the live environment. Never. You just don't test on prod.
It's the absolute foundation of modern engineering, isn't it? You have development, then testing, staging, and then production. That's the pipeline.
And when that safety pipeline is intentionally bypassed, especially by a company like Cloudflare that, manages a huge chunk of the internet.
The internet notices, and we get a critical outage.
That is the core of our deep dive today. We are unpacking the details of the December 5th Cloudflare outage.
And our sources here are an excellent post-mortem article and just dozens of comments from senior engineers all across the industry.
And they are all unanimous on one thing. Bypassing these safety measures, and I'm quoting here, will eventually end in a major or minor disaster.
But our mission today is to move past the simple, they broke the rule judgment. We need to really understand the environment that made breaking that rule seem like the only option.
Exactly. We're drilling into this excruciating tension between speed, security, and the just sheer complexity of these massive distributed systems. Was this a symptom of, systemic laxness?
Or was it an extraordinary measure that was genuinely required by an extraordinary threat?
Okay, let's unpack this. So to really get why this was such a big deal, we first need to just confirm the standard path, lay out that ideal pipeline for us.
Absolutely. So ideally, it's very structured. You start in dev, right? Development. That's where engineers are building the new features, the breaking changes.
Okay.
Then it moves to a testing phase, unit tests, integration tests. But the really critical step is staging.
Dress rehearsal.
Exactly. Staging is meant to be a precise, near-perfect replica of the actual production environment. Only after everything works perfectly in staging does it get the green light for prod.
That's the rational, time-tested approach. It's
Right.
supposed to catch any problems before you and I see them.
Right. It theoretically catches any conflict.
But on December 5th, Cloudflare blew right past that safety net. And the motivation, it wasn't just carelessness, it was a fire drill. A huge one.
It was. The catalyst was a critical, and actively exploited vulnerability. It was tracked as CVE 2025-55182.
And this was in something called React Server Components, or RSC.
Yeah, and for listeners who don't live in web frameworks, just think of RSC as these components that render content really fast on the server side before it even gets to your browser.
So a vulnerability there is a big deal. It's core.
It's a huge deal. The threat is immediate.
And the fix itself, it sounded relatively simple, didn't it? Just a configuration change.
Simple in concept, yeah, but incredibly complex in execution. The patch required increasing the allowed input payload size. They needed a 1 millibit buffer.
Why that specific?
Well, it was likely to prevent certain types of buffer overflow attacks, or maybe just to handle larger, legitimate data packets that the security fix itself required. So they started rolling this out gradually on production.
Which is a safe practice.
It's generally a safe practice, yes, a slow rollout.
So they were being cautious. Where did the train go off the rails?
During that slow rollout on prod, they hit a purely internal obstacle, one of their own internal testing tools, which was monitoring the whole deployment. It was hard-coded to not support the new 1 megabit buffer size.
Wait, hold on. So the system was failing a test because the test itself was broken?
Precisely. And this is the crucial decision point.
Yeah.
They have a massive active vulnerability. The house is on fire.
Right.
They could pause the patch, fix their own internal tool, and maybe lose days in the process while customers are exposed.
Clear.
Or they could just eliminate the obstacle.
And they eliminated the obstacle. So that the fatal step was this decision to just globally disable the broken internal testing tool.
Yes, and that bypassed the gradual rollout mechanism entirely. It just pushed the new configuration live instantly.
And that action that created the failure.
It instantly created the condition for failure. Cloudflare runs a huge amount of traffic through what they call their FL1 proxy.
Right.
It's powered by the Lua scripting language.
Okay.
When they disabled that tool globally, the config change meant that this Lua-based proxy encountered a value that was, it was empty. It's called an NIL value.
So if the proxy script is expecting some parameter, let's say a number for the payload size, and instead gets just a blank, a nothing.
Exactly. It's like asking a calculator to divide by a variable that just doesn't exist. Not 0, but nothing. And the script wasn't robust enough to handle that NIL value.
So it just crashed.
Instead of gracefully logging an error, the requests hitting that proxy failed instantly, catastrophically, widespread HTTP 500 errors, widespread outages.
And the source material points out that this wasn't a totally isolated incident, right?
That's the critical context, yeah. The article suggested this might be indicative of a deeper problem.
Because they had a similar implosion recently with their newer Rust-based FL2 proxy.
Right, and that failed after handling a corrupted input file. So the history suggests this pattern where unusual inputs, whether it's a disabled internal tool or a corrupt file, aren't being properly vetted before they hit the live network.
Which is why the article floats the idea of systemic issues.
Exactly, how configurations and these weird edge cases are validated before going live.
And that assertion of systemic issues, that brings us right to the core debate here. Because when you talk to engineers about this decision, the initial reaction is, it's brutal.
Oh, it's visceral.
There's this overwhelming consensus that this lazy mindset is what kills infrastructure.
It absolutely is. I saw so many comments stressing that when you break deployment stages, even for what feels like a good reason, it just signals deeper process rot.
And the argument is that when you circumvent testing, you're probably not setting up good rollback plans either.
Exactly. So if the quick fix fails, the disaster just gets bigger.
I remember one anecdote from the comments that really stuck with me. This engineer whose vacation was, and I quote, trashed because a colleague decided to breach these guidelines.
It really boils down to trust in human time, doesn't it? The cost.
It does. For a lot of people, skipping tests, even for a critical CDE fix, is just a lame excuse.
It's seen as proof that the process underneath is just too brittle. The argument is, the CIO should be preparing for an external audit because this kind of thing isn't just a technical glitch.
A governance failure.
It's a governance failure.
But wait a minute. We have to look at the other side of this. We are talking about an actively exploited vulnerability. CVE 2025-55182. Cloudflare's entire business model is protecting customers from exactly this.
And here's where it gets so fascinating.
Yeah.
This is the excruciating trade-off. What's fascinating here is that the classic model says never risk stability.
Right.
But the modern security world often demands never risk a customer exploit.
Okay, so let's play that out. If they had waited 2 days to fix their internal tool and roll out the fix properly, and in those 2 days, hundreds of their customers got breached.
Is that not an infinitely worse outcome for the business, for the internet, than a 3-hour service outage?
That's the question.
And that is the core of the counterargument. Several experts in the comments were explicit about this. They chose the quick, temporary risk of an outage, which is a PR problem, over the long-term, catastrophic risk of mass customer hacking. That's a security, legal, and a trust problem.
So it's a pure risk calculation.
What's the worst headline? What's the worst outcome? And the consensus from that side is that for a threat this critical, it genuinely may have required extraordinary measures.
But isn't risking an outage on the internet's backbone itself fundamentally worse than, risking an exploit on a few customer systems? The scale of Cloudflare's impact is just so huge.
That's a powerful point. But the data flow through Cloudflare is so massive, delaying the fix is like leaving a giant gaping hole in the web's defenses.
So it's not just a few customers.
It's potentially hundreds of thousands of customers being exposed through one weak point. And in their view, mitigating that systemic security risk just had to take precedence over deployment stability.
So how do we solve this impossible choice between speed and caution? The comments did offer a kind of structural solution for this, right?
They did. This isn't just about judging Cloudflare, it's about looking forward. The suggestion is that massive infrastructure providers like Cloudflare need to be looped into the CVE disclosure process earlier.
The common vulnerabilities and exposures process. What's the benefit of getting that info earlier?
Well, if Cloudflare got a detailed heads up about the CVE before it was publicly disclosed, before it was actively exploited,
They'd have time.
they'd have the time, days, maybe even weeks, to engineer the buffer fix, to test it thoroughly in staging, and to update all their internal tools. It removes the impossible choice entirely.
So the current security timeline, where the threat and the disclosure happen almost at the same time, is what forces companies into these risky plays.
Exactly.
That's a fascinating systemic solution to a process problem. But this whole debate, it all comes down to the environment they operate in.
The scale.
Which brings us to our next section, the complexity paradox.
Yes. We have to stop thinking of Cloudflare as just a standard website or application. It is a large-scale distributed system. It handles a massive percentage of the world's internet traffic.
I think we all just assume that a company that big must have a perfect replica of their live system for testing, a perfect staging environment.
And that assumption is precisely where the traditional engineering mindset it breaks down at this scale.
How so?
The industry reality, and this was voiced over and over in our source material, is that for a system of Cloudflare's size, with its dynamic routing, proprietary hardware, the sheer volume of connections, it is just not possible to have an exact, accurate copy of production in a pre-prod environment.
So perfect replication is inaccurate or infeasible.
Exactly.
So if your staging environment isn't perfectly accurate, what's the risk there?
The risk is false confidence. You run your tests, they all pass with flying colors in staging, but because that environment lacks the true complexity, the real traffic patterns, the weird interactions between config files, you deploy to prod feeling safe.
Only to hit some bizarre edge case that the test environment could never have predicted.
We couldn't possibly account for it.
So the very scale of their operation invalidates the core safety principle we started this whole deep dive with.
It forces a modification of it. For these massive systems, the standard approach shifts from the safety of staging to the robustness of the deployment mechanism itself. This is where the rolling upgrade comes in.
Explain that difference.
A rolling upgrade means you deploy the update very gradually, say to 5% of your servers. You watch it like a hawk. If that 5% fails, you immediately roll back that small segment.
Without causing a global outage.
Right. And that's what they were trying to do on December 5th. But when they hit that snag with the internal tool, they bypassed that entire mechanism.
By just disabling the tool globally. And what makes this even more complex is that the postmortem found that the final catastrophic failure, that NIL value crashing the Lua proxy, was actually an unrelated side effect of the config change.
Yes. It wasn't the CVE fix itself that was buggy. It was a configuration change forced by a time crunch, which had an unexpected secondary ripple effect on a completely different piece of legacy infrastructure.
The Lua proxy.
Which just proves that complexity is the great enemy here. You can fix one problem, but the complex system introduces 10 new ways for things to fail.
Complexity makes things harder to test, harder to get right, and I imagine hardest of all to diagnose and fix once they fail. So it doesn't matter how many staging environments they have. If the system's complexity can't be replicated, they hit an unbreakable truth.
And that truth, as we saw repeated again and again in the comments, is the unavoidable, often uncomfortable reality for these huge organizations. There's no test like production.
Production is the final test environment. So where does that leave us? What does this all mean? The Cloudflare incident is this powerful lens into the incredible pressure on the engineers who manage the internet's backbone.
It's a constant tightrope walk. You have robust, slow, careful testing on one side.
Staging.
And then you have rapid, risky deployment on the other, which is sometimes necessary to fight off these urgent, actively exploited security threats.
And the processes that worked for a smaller company, where you could actually replicate your environment, they just break down for these massive cloud providers.
They do. They're operating at a scale where complexity makes a perfect safety net basically an impossibility. We saw a high-pressure decision between two bad options outage or exploit, and that whole thing hinged on a failure to update a single internal tool.
It's a really necessary look behind the curtain, I think. It shows that even the most advanced organizations are wrestling with these trade-offs that have no easy answers.
And that brings up a final, thought-provoking question for you to consider. If we accept that perfect replication of these massive production environments is impossible, is the very goal of IT security fundamentally shifting?
What do you mean?
Are we moving away from the ideal of preventing failures in staging and instead focusing purely on engineering systems that can minimize the time it takes to detect and rapidly roll back failures once they inevitably hit production?
So detection and recovery speed become more important than prevention.
If that becomes the ultimate metric of success, what does that mean for the stability of the internet tomorrow?